A key development issue is climate change, and the challenge that we are faced with is how do we use the intellectual capital that we have to come up with frameworks and methodologies that are able to put critical global issues like climate change, one, on the agenda, and secondly, to measure and to give feedback so that decision makers and politicians take it seriously. We need to start by acknowledging we are in a crisis. And there's a lot of evidence that indicates that we are in a crisis. We also need to acknowledge that given the nature of the weather system of the world, what happens in one place invariably affects other places. And the third very critical point is that the actions of some nations in some parts of the world tend to have an adverse effect on other parts of the world. We see this in terms of pollutants, which come from one part and end up affecting the livelihoods of people in another part. We see it in terms of the sharp changes that one has in terms of weather patterns and the extent to which this has made the vulnerable more susceptible to crisis. We also see that what is beginning to happen is that it takes longer for the poor to come out of the cycle of poverty because you have an additional factor of climate change. And given the fact that most of the poor people in the world are still dependent on the environment, engaged in agriculture, they are much more vulnerable to the variation that happens in the world as far as climate goes. There's two levels at which evaluators face challenges. The first is conceptual, which obviously then leads to the second issue of methodological. In terms of the conceptual level, there still is a lot of contestation about who causes the problems and who has the adverse effects of these actions that happen in some part of the globe and the other. We need, as evaluators, criteria, indicators, benchmarks, and in many instances there is inadequate consensus on these. So if an evaluation tends to point very negatively at the effect of pollution and were to go and be even more diagnostic to identify which part of the globe this is initiated by and which part of the globe's people receive the adverse effect of, it tends to become contested. Because you're also dealing with an analysis in a context of inequality. And the inequality is political inequality and inequality around resources and access to that. So evaluators are at one level obliged to produce an evaluation which indicates what the causes and effects are, but do so in a context that is extremely political and very contested. And unfortunately, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of heat, but inadequate light in this area. But the only way to do something, to get past this hurdle, is to do it. And to go and to deal with the problems as they emerge. And I'm happy to report that we have a memorandum of understanding between the Evaluation Office of the UNDP and the Global Environmental Facility, both which are independent offices that have the convening power to bring together the intellectual capital that is necessary to think through how does one evaluate elements of programs which then indicate effects at a broader global level. So even if one were to go into a fishing community in some remote part of the world, a good evaluation should be able to talk about how this remote village is located and affected by actions from thousands of miles away. And that's what makes the whole area of evaluating climate change and environmental evaluation so conceptually exciting. But also it is very important that it moves beyond the level of the diagnosis into the level of the solutions. And we all know that is much more difficult. From the experience to the knowledge, from the knowledge to the action becomes the element. Because to get the agreements that are necessary to mitigate the adverse effects of climate change on the vulnerable majority and poor of the world is something that takes place in a context where there's an unequal balance of power. And these are the debates that need to come to the surface. But evaluation independent functions need to talk truth to power. They need to put these issues on, not just on the table for some intellectual discussion. It has to eventually, as difficult as it is, translate into policies, programs, interventions that reverse what we have, which is a very, very concerning pattern of environmental change that is adversely affecting all of the world's people. And we see it in terms of the periodicity of crisis. We see it just about daily. We acknowledge it, but the change hasn't happened.